Good morning, everyone, and welcome to my next part of talking about gender dysphoria. I just recorded actually these slides already once and realized the audio just wasn't there. So my bad for not checking the microphone. And so anyway, I'm Dr. Christine Coons, and I'm here to talk about more about gender dysphoria. And yeah, I wanted to kind of extend off of the previous discussion where we talked about the history of gender dysphoria and that the evolution of terms in history has been a work in progress. And this set of slides is going to talk about what gender dysphoria is, isn't, and how do we take it from one step to the other. My next set of slides, my next video is I anticipate is how do we approach individuals with gender dysphoria and at least throw out some ideas of things we can do to help understand people better and work with this. So without too much further ado, go into a little bit more of this presentation. So just a quick recap, gender incongruence dysphoria has been around since ancient times. This is nothing entirely new. And we can see this across different cultures and timeframes around the world. There are definitely societies and cultures that have accepted more than just two genders in our society. Um, Many of the terms that we have used for sexual identity has evolved over the decades. We used to be looking at the term sex and gender as synonymous, and over time that these terms have evolved and stretched and got closer and separated in time and space. But the way we currently look at it now is sex is biologic sex and gender is our identity or that internal sense of self. These concepts of these terms have evolved from the work that we've done with people with differences in sexual development. This is an extension, this is a process of taking what we've known in the past and evolving our understanding and taking it to that next step. Gender dysphoria is a heterogeneous presentation. There's a lot of things that are associated with gender dysphoria. It's not just one thing, it's a collection of things. And I've used this diagram in the past. I used it with my discussions on the sexes and even during the previous slide. Actually, I need to update this picture because this one's not quite complete. I added two little slices to the pie, the pituitary gland and the adrenal gland. Historically, society, back in the 1900s, there has been a focus on intersex individuals trying to understand who they were. This is also the era of where we actually looked at people like with Klinefelters and Turners and tried to understand them better. And it wasn't until the 1960s, 1970s do we actually put a reason to a lot of these conditions. And the names that we used in the past certainly have evolved and gotten better over time. Um, yeah, looking back at the historical terms, it was very clear that they were incomplete and a lot of times very derogatory to the individual as they experience these things. One of the sad realities of what we've done in the past is that we've taken these conditions, these situations, and we've hid these things. We've hid individuals who are intersex or have differences of sexual development because we view them as not whole or complete. Um, they were felt to be odd or different enough. How do we deal with this? How do we manage this? And our understanding at the time was incomplete. And thankfully, we have better understood more about who we are as individuals and overall our development. So we really started recognizing that there is genetic components. There's chromosomal abnormalities leading to these alterations in primary and secondary sex characteristics. And our evolution of understanding these ambiguities led to questions regarding our gender identity. This is why this slide exists, is that when you look at our gender identity, that internal sense of self, and the physical body that we are given, gender dysphoria is that relationship between those two things. that's I can't express how important that is. It's a relationship. So as we take this into the general population, we're realizing that more and more that people who have differences of sexual development may have subclinical manifestations. They may not always appear with external manifestations at birth, that there's more to this than just meets the eye. So it is important to recognize that transgender individuals may have a difference of sexual development. That's not always the case. It's also important to realize that not everybody who has a difference of sexual development is transgender. The article that I usually use for this situation is people who are Klinefelters. Most Klinefelters individuals identify as male, but not all of them do. Not all of them have ambiguous genitalia, but some do. There's about 5% of people with Klinefelters that identify as transgender or they have gender dysphoria. So even though there's this association between differences of sexual development, it's not the only thing that there's associations with. And I discussed about that previously. There are other things that we need to recognize as contributory to gender dysphoria. It's not the only thing that is out there. So what is gender dysphoria? What is it? And what do we do with it? So again, it comes down to that relationship between gender and identity and physical body. And understanding that relationship is very individual. It's that person who is experiencing it. And oftentimes, the person who is experiencing it is limited with their ability to express it. And so one of the things that we do as clinicians is we try to give them tools to be able to express themselves, give them the words, give them the ability to say, it's this and not this. These are things that help me. These things are things that don't help me. And picking and choosing things that are helpful, that are also healthy, that help them to grow and be uplifted is important in the part of all this. So I give this example of, a child in 4th grade is going to be able to describe their symptoms or behave differently than somebody who's an adult who's been experiencing this lifelong. Oftentimes, gender dysphoria is hard to describe. One of the examples I usually use with this is, how do you describe salt, the taste of salt? And not use the word salty. It's just something that we inherently feel with ourselves, but be able to use that term, how do you describe the taste of salt? How do you describe gender dysphoria? There's a lot of different ways to describe it. It is a complex relationship between our mind and our body. It's not just an easy pathway that goes through. It's multiple pathways. It's multiple relationships. Because there are other things that are associated with this, like abuse or trauma or even puberty, there may be other things that are affecting this that are making it more difficult to pin down why this is the way it's working. Sometimes symptoms ebb and flow. They come, there's good days, they come, they're bad days, they go, there's good days, but overall, it's a pattern that we're seeing. So this is not just a one thing experience. This is a period of time that is people are experiencing gender dysphoria. Keep in mind, people with gender dysphoria often put on a show. They try to act that part of their assigned sex because they're afraid of being shamed, bullied, or other potential real threats. Sometimes that happens and it's not clear that there's an obvious history. When we look at family members who come out to their parents, they say, well, you never showed me any history of this. Well, that's because they were trying to hide it. So this is according to the DSM-5. The definition of gender dysphoria is that feeling of distress and incongruence between an individual's physically represented sex and internal representations of gender identity. This is a diagnosable condition. One of the things I frequently hear is, this is all made up. Well, according to the medical community, it's not. It is a diagnosable code, and there it is right there, ICD-10, code F64.9. This is what I use to put on medical documentation, a diagnosis of what's going on. And oh, this is used worldwide too, by the way. So because there's so many different ways to approach and view gender dysphoria, or to how they have various symptoms and presentations, here's a couple of presentations that I was able to piece together from different individuals. I selected 3. Just to give an idea and context of, here are some potential words that can be utilized to describe what gender dysphoria is. This isn't going to apply to everybody. People experience this differently from person to person. This right here is my experience. And I usually use headphones, a description of headphones like I'm wearing right now, that I cannot take off. And back in the old days when we turned on TVs or radios, we always had to find that station. And in between the station, from station to station, was all this static. And if you remember looking at a TV, it was kind of this peppery white and black screen that just always moved like little ants going across the screen. But there was always this noise, this shh. There was nothing that was in tune. And that never went away. It ebbed and flowed. There were times where it was louder, there was times it was softer, but it would always be there. And it really depended on the circumstances of the day. I found that one of the things that helped me to cope with that at the time was to excessively work or distract myself from that noise. But every time that I went into a down moment or I was on vacation, that came back really loud, and I hated that. Actually, vacations were some of the worst times that I had growing up, because that noise was always there, and it always was worse in those down moments. Over time, that static dulls your emotions, and it can lead to suicidal and thoughts and depression. Another individual described it as a pressure cooker. At its highest pressure, there's that tension, there's that anxiety, there's always that sense of something is wrong. And maybe like the idea of, I left the oven on or the iron going. This person said that they could blow off steam from time to time with various activities, but that pressure always built right back up again. We see this kind of with patterns of gender dysphoria. People who experience this often cross-dress. And as they go through this experience of cross-dressing, oftentimes they buy clothes. They wear the clothes for a period of time, and then that sense of shame comes into play, and they purge these clothes, only to tell themselves they'll never do it again, but only to revisit the cycle, because the gender dysphoria never goes away. The last one I present is a child. Ever since this child started expressing words, they stated that they were a girl. And whenever the parents tried to push typical boy clothes or toys, the child always resisted and pushed back. And what was amazing with these parents is they learned to adjust their thinking and processes to the child's interests, what made them happy, what expanded them, and what uplifted this child. And what once was a child that was anxious and depressed and even had behavior concerns, all of a sudden turned into a child that was amazing, that they were able to expand their talents and ability and express themselves in a more in a way that was helpful to that child. So as you can see, it depends on the circumstances. There's 3 different experiences from different people that describe gender dysphoria or experience gender dysphoria, and the ways that we cope with it is different from person to person. Now, one of the real facts behind this is suicide is very real with people with gender dysphoria. As you go back to this experience of mine with the static, after a period of time, it wears you out. It brings you down. It's like people with chronic illnesses. It's very well-known scientific fact that people with chronic illness get depression and can develop suicide. suicidal ideation as a consequence of that. This is the same idea. This constant just gender dysphoria, this constant not understanding who we are, our internal sense of self, does build up over time, and it can lead to suicide. And that's been well confirmed throughout the medical literature. Many times people with gender dysphoria ask themselves why. And as a consequence of this why, they try to self-treat because they fear being outed, because of fear of repercussions. They try to do what they can to cope with the symptoms. A lot of times they can hyper-focus on religion, self-help books, cross-dressing, hyper-masculine or hyper-feminine activities. One that I see relatively frequently is assigned male at birth going into the military because that's quote unquote the most masculine thing that they can think of. They'll take supplements because that's what they heard on the internet. They look at black market medications, intense study, advancing their field way beyond what they need to. It's not unusual for people with gender dysphoria to be doctors, lawyers, business people, these incredibly successful individuals. There's this misconception that people who have gender dysphoria are undereducated, which is simply not true. So why do they do that? Why do these activities? Well, they fear being outed. They fear the society and the family repercussions. It's not an unusual experience for individuals who are transgender or a part of the LGBTQ spectrum to be kicked out of their home because of religious beliefs, because of society beliefs, cultural beliefs. Work and school can be affected. Depending on circumstances at work, people can get fired as a consequence of this. Relationships can change. It's a financial risk. And a lot of times people at the very end of all this ask, is it really worth it? And come down to getting back to this idea of suicidal ideation. This is a very real thing that happens. When people hyper-focus and get into these incredibly difficult tasks, they burn themselves out. And as a consequence of that, can develop suicidal ideation, depression, and things like that. So as a final thoughts on this, again, going back to gender dysphoria, this isn't a new thing. This is something that just didn't appear recently. What has happened is our understanding of it has gotten better and is continuing to improve over time. Where we are at today is not where we were at 5 years ago. Our understanding is expanding more rapidly, and in 5 years from now, we're going to be understanding so much more than even we know now. Gender dysphoria has a reason to exist. It is vitally important to actually do a workup and figure out why this individual is expressing the way that they are, and to take them individually. Maybe it is an experience that they had. Maybe it is just straight up puberty. Maybe it is a social interaction. And I use that with a caveat because we don't want to just fall on that idea, because there are other situations where it's a subclinical difference of sexual development, or it's an intersex individual. And we need to treat them individually and respect them individually. The long-term consequence of unaddressed and untreated gender dysphoria is very real. And I think with this presentation, I think that at least gives some idea of what people go through. So my next set of slides is I want to actually address how we approach individuals with gender dysphoria. What are some things that we can do to help out the situation? Even more than just using names and pronouns, what are some things that we can do to help these individuals understand that relationship between gender identity and their body, and how they can work through it and manage themselves to become better and be uplifted as they work through this process. So thank you for your time.